Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am the Honourable Member for Halifax, and in the riding of Halifax, we have a deep connection with the Atlantic Ocean. And for some, it's just the summer months, you know, recreation, having some fun on the beach. But for others, particularly those who work on the water, that connection to the Atlantic Ocean is year-round. And of course, you know, we all know that the ocean provides many benefits for our communities, and we also think of the ocean as being this beautiful thing, right? We stand and we look off into the distance at the horizon, and it is breathtaking. But it's really interesting, our relationship to the ocean at home. If you go to any of the small fishing communities in Nova Scotia, you'll see a house on a bluff overlooking the ocean. But if you look closely, very often, Mr. Speaker, the side of the house that faces the ocean doesn't have a window. Or if it does, it just has a small little window over the sink. And it's interesting when, especially when tourists come and they see and they think, why wouldn't you have wrap-around windows on the side of the house and a deck overlooking the ocean? And why are all these houses built without windows facing the ocean? And I've had it explained to me a couple of different ways that I think are really compelling and really touch your heart. Some people have said to me, why would you want a view of the factory that you work at? Every day you're at work, you spend 10, 12 hours there, and you come home just to look at the factory. That's not something that you'd want to do. Fair enough, it's where you work, right? Other folks have explained it to me as, why would you have your home facing the source of so much anxiety and possibly pain? Your family members go out to go fishing in the morning, and you wait. You wait to see if they'll come back. You wait to see if the weather will change. You wait to see. You just wait. And that constant reminder of having those windows facing the ocean just can bring you a lot of heartache sometimes. And you can go, this isn't just in Nova Scotia, I'm sure it's the same in New Brunswick, I'm sure it's, and I know it's the same in Newfoundland. It is an interesting, it is a difficult tension that we have with the ocean. My colleague from Dartmouth Cole Harbour was talking about the Ocean Ranger, and he encouraged members of this House to pick that book up, written by Susan Dodd, and the publisher is Fernwood, Nova Scotia publisher. And I agree with him. People really should pick up this book. It's a fantastic book, and you heard that Susan Dodd actually wrote this book when her brother was actually killed in the Ocean Ranger disaster. Ocean Ranger sank off the coast of Newfoundland, and they did lose a crew of 84 men. And it was called the worst sea disaster in Canada since the Second World War, but at the same time, people talked about it sort of like it was just the situation of a bad storm. You know, it sort of faded into our memories. You know, media sort of talked about it like extreme weather, and it was on the weather pages, frankly. And Susan Dodd actually worked to take that history and compile it and pull it out of the weather section and really piece together. She maps out the socio-political processes of the aftermath. She maps out where the money is, the power, where the hopes for the future are, and really brings it into a fuller picture of lessons learned. Lessons learned by a heroic industry advancing technology in the face of a pretty brutal environment. And I want to read actually a review of it, because I think it really bears on what we're talking about today. So Eric Tucker, Osgoode Hall Law School, York University. And the review is, this is an extraordinary book, much more than a personal narrative about the impact of an industrial disaster on a family. Dodd explores memory of industrial disasters as a complex and multi-layered project. Her reading of government reports, lawsuits, and monetary settlements, songs and novels illuminate the different ways the past is commemorated and reconstructed, and the implications for moving forward. Dodd's discussion of personal injury litigation and the role of monetary compensation, or blood money, should be mandatory reading for all first-year law students. And I thought that was appropriate to read because the mandatory reading for first-year law students. We're not first-year law students here, Mr. Speaker, but we are talking about law. That's what we're talking about right now. We are debating a bill that will, that may or may not, depending on votes, become law. I suspect it will become law. And it's important for us to have the bigger picture in mind when we are talking about law. And the bigger picture does include the overall health and safety of workers. You know, in the riding of Halifax, there actually are fishing villages in the riding I represent, and one of these fishing villages, Sambro, every year we go out for a blessing of the fleet. It's quite magical. We go out onto the water, and Reverend Kelty from St. James United Church comes, and we have a wreath, and we have flowers, and she blesses the fleet. She blesses the recreational boats, she blesses the fishing boats, she blesses the Coast Guard boats, and blesses the people who will be working at sea, and we pay tribute to the lives lost at sea. And that's the reality of our communities, Mr. Speaker. And that reality, the harsh reality, is something we want to avoid. We want to avoid certain incidents, like the incident in 1999 when I asked my colleague from Dartmouth Cole Harbour a question. I talked about the Nordic Apollo when Sean Hatcher died. We want to avoid that situation where at the end of it, no one is apparently responsible. There are no charges laid. There's no, how does this happen? But there's nothing for us to do because the NSLOPB or the sorry, I'm getting my NLs and NSs, Nova Scotia Offshore Petroleum Board and Newfoundland Offshore Petroleum Board aren't these agencies. They aren't safety agencies. So we have a terrible tragedy like the Nordic Apollo, and it was not only not prevented, but then there were no consequences. There was no recrimination. And I think that looking at a bill like C5, we need to think about prevention. We also do need to think about consequences. I don't think that health and safety hazards should be business as usual. I think we actually have to work proactively to formally legislate and enforce safety and health standards. And that's why we're here, right, is to legislate. That's what this place is all about. And that's why the NDP does support this bill as a step forward for tackling safety for offshore workers, but we do need to continue to work beyond it. I think that this bill is quite timely since we are seeing a situation off the coast, off the shores of Nova Scotia, where there's new exploration by Shell and BP for the first time since the 2010 BP oil spill off the Gulf Coast. These are important things to keep in mind as well. But what we can do is ensure that greater efforts can be made to recognize these kinds of dangers and to also prevent future injuries and deaths in the workplace. So what do I like about this bill, C5? Well, I do like the fact that it fills in a gap of legislation that's existed for decades, since 1992, when amendments to the Atlantic Accord first separated out health from safety issues. And it creates a framework that does spell out the individual and shared roles and responsibilities of the federal government, the provincial government, regulators, employers, operators, suppliers, and employees. I also like the fact that it provides employees with the right to refuse to perform an activity that they have reasonable cause to believe is unsafe. And I think we need to rely on an employee's judgment. If they are uncomfortable performing that task, they should have the right to refuse it. And if an employee actually does report an unsafe condition, well, then they should be able to do so without fear of reprisal. And I also like the fact that C5 provides regulatory boards and operator authorities, the authority to disclose relevant occupational health and safety information to the public. Finally, I will say that this bill does support occupational health and safety. It supports a culture of occupational health and safety, and it does recognize shared responsibilities in the workplace. So these are some of the aspects that I do like. not just for their content, not just for what they do, but I also like them because they really represent a victory for the labor movement and for the NDP, if I can be so bold, because both the labor movement and the NDP have been advocating for legislated offshore safety regime for years. So, bravo. But, and you knew there had to be a but, though there are many aspects of C5 that I think are constructive and that push forward workers' health and safety, I do have to stress that this really is only the beginning. It is really just the tip of the iceberg. I do think there's a lot of room for improvement here. And the NDP is committed to working with the provinces. If we were government, we would open up that conversation with provinces to actually put forward measures that would further strengthen and improve the safety regime for offshore workers in Newfoundland and Labrador as well as Nova Scotia. Speaking of Nova Scotia, I would like to give a big shout out to the Nova Scotia, former NDP Nova Scotia government, who put a lot of work into this issue, and they made these safety issues a priority, Mr. Speaker. They worked to protect offshore workers equally as well as the work that onshore workers do. And in fact, the labor movement in both Newfoundland and Labrador and in Nova Scotia work closely with their respective provincial governments, and we should all really be proud of their achievements in collaboration with these governments to establish a protective regime for offshore workers in the oil and gas industry. We have seen some, you probably know, Mr. Speaker, that this is mirror legislation that will be passing through provinces as well. And we had a situation in the spring where we had mirror legislation with Nova Scotia and the federal government around the Sable Island bill, creating Sable Island National Park. And it can be a pretty hostile environment here. It can be pretty partisan here. But a bill like C5 or a bill like the Sable Island National Park bill are examples of what we can do when we work together, when the federal government does work collaboratively with provinces, because very often provinces know what they need on the ground, but it is the federal government, only the federal government, that can actually enact the legislation. And I will give credit where credit is due and say that the consultation project around, the consultation process around Sable Island was exceptional. I really do think that Parks Canada did a great job of making sure that Nova Scotians and people in Halifax had their voices heard. So we have a situation here where the federal government has been working with the provinces. The Nova Scotia NDP did pass C5's mirror legislation in the legislature in May of this year. And they have also said that the provincial legislation was a good start. But they come back to the Wells Report, and we've heard a lot today about the Wells Report, specifically Recommendation 29. I'll quote Charlie Parker, who is our former, I don't know how to say that, who was our energy minister, who said, industry and offshore employees need consistent regulations when it comes to health and safety on the job, especially since we're dealing with an industry that overlaps federal jurisdiction in 2 provinces. Good point. This is why we have mirror legislation. This is why the provinces and the feds need to work together. Former Energy Minister Charlie Parker also said, the proposed amendments will provide clear authority on issues of occupational health and safety and better protect people involved in offshore oil and gas. This legislation complements the work already underway to promote workplace safety in every industry across the province to ensure all workers, whether on land or sea, return home safe at the end of the day. And that's the point, isn't it, Mr. Speaker? So it goes to show that this is an important improvement to the offshore occupational health and safety regime that the NDP has called for in all the relevant jurisdictions, not just here at the federal level. So I want to talk about this idea of the standalone safety regulator, because I think that's the big piece that's missing in C5. You heard my colleague from Dartmouth Cole Harbour talk about the Westray bill, and he talked about the need for a dedicated prosecutor in situations like that. He talked about the Westray bill and the fact that while it was a huge victory that this bill passed, no one has been charged. So we can sometimes create something, but unless it's actually going to be effective, it's all for naught. So what we need is to create an independent standalone safety regulator, but also to ensure that it's effective. Because that's the big omission that really stands out for me in CE5. Because when Justice Wells was making his recommendations on safety, he included that recommendation for an independent standalone safety regulator to be established. And on this point, in the Wells report, he said, the safety regulator should be separate from and independent from all other components of offshore regulation and should stand alone, with safety being its only regulatory task. Independent and standalone safety regulators are now in place in Norway, the United Kingdom, and Australia. And the same concept is, I understand, being developed in the United States for the Gulf of Mexico. That's the end of his quote. And that's the key thing, that it should be their only regulatory task. This shouldn't be the job of the CNLOPB or the CNSOPB. It should be the job of an independent safety regulator. So Justice Wells concluded that he included an important warning on why independence is a necessary condition for the regulator. And he said that the problem is that without independence, we risk the development of a culture of regulatory capture. So this is when relationships are fostered between the safety regulator and the organization subject to the safety regulations that ultimately lead to a little bit of the bending of the rules, a bit of lack of compliance, and we need to ensure that we don't get into that regulatory capture culture. So I do want to be clear that he didn't actually find that this culture existed already, but that we have to be vigilant against it when we are dealing with human health and safety. Justice Wells also recommended some alternative options if it wasn't possible to establish a safety regulator. He recommended that the government create a separate autonomous safety division of the CNLOPB with a separate budget, separate leadership, and an organizational structure designed to deal only with safety matters. He recommended that the government establish an advisory board composed of mature and experienced persons fully representative of the community and who are unconnected with the oil industry. And finally, he recommended that the government ensure that the safety division would have the mandate and ability to engage, either on staff or as consultants, expert advisors to assist it in its regulatory tasks. And I think those are three very, very reasonable recommendations, that it be separate, that the people who are on it be experienced and not have links to the oil industry, and that they have the ability to hire experts. It makes very good sense, and yet in C5 we don't actually see any evidence of that. This bill doesn't include even one of those alternatives, and it's silent on this front, whether it's an independent safety regulator or one of the alternatives. And I think it's not only puzzling, I think it's very concerning. So the NDP, although we support this legislation for the improvements that it makes, we are very concerned that Justice Wells has been ignored on this point, and we will continue to push for that independent standalone safety regulator. Now, I'll move to the length of time that it took to take action on this. Obviously, Mr. Speaker, there are clear reasons why this bill was necessary, and it's only fair that offshore workers have sufficient health and safety standards. This is why the provinces took action themselves on this file. And in fact, the NDP government in Nova Scotia under Darrell Dexter was a leader on this file, and I think he did great work. And as you heard, we did pass mirror legislation this May. But the provinces needed the federal government to take action as well, because this is, like I said, a joint initiative. So the lack of federal action has actually rendered the provincial action pointless. I mean, it takes two to tango, and the provinces were pulling up their end of the deal, and the feds were nowhere to be found. There has been a 14-year delay for federal action. I will be fair and say the Conservatives are only responsible for the last 8 years, but the Liberals were, of course, responsible for the 6 years before that. And we need the feds to actually work with provinces. Like I said earlier, provinces know what we need on the ground. They know what our communities need. They have good ideas, but sometimes it does fall to the federal jurisdiction to actually legislate, and I don't understand why we have seen such a delay. And mind you, rarely understand government's priorities, so I don't know why I'm particularly puzzled on that one. But thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll wrap it up with that. I appreciate your attention.